Murphy, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I do welcome the debate, but I do question the timing of it. I mean, the Convention gave this issue 2 weekends, and we're giving it 90 minutes at the very end of the term. And as a result, there's no one here. And not only does that, I think, treat the Convention's work unfairly because they put so much time into it, but this is a serious issue. You know, if we're serious about changing our political structures and systems, but also reforming the culture of politics in this country, then electoral reform is right at the heart of that. And so 90 minutes on what the Convention has done at the end of term, and given all of their work, I don't think is sufficient. But I suppose it's an opportunity to speak, so we should. I don't know if we've decided yet how we're going to treat these recommendations. I mean, it seems clear from the Minister's statement that there is a particular way on offer. I mean, do we accept them all? Do we cherry pick? If we do, who then gets to decide? And, you know, the Convention's work can't be binding. So does it then become an academic exercise, although perhaps a worthwhile one? I mean, if we look at one of the statements in the speech from the Minister, this is on the issue of the smallest constituencies having being 5-seaters. The government is of the view that the 3, 4 or 5-seat Dáil constituency arrangement has served the state well since 1948. And that's it, not accepted. It's a complete lack of imagination from the government, unfortunately. But what does that say for the Convention's work? Because when you look at the recommendations that are accepted, like the establishing of an electoral commission, well, guess what? We were doing that anyway. It was in our programme for government. And when you look at other recommendations like postal ballots or extending voting on weekends, we're going to give that to the Electoral Commission to do. So what actually was the purpose of this work? I mean, they're very interesting reports. A lot of time has been put into them. But I'm just not sure what the purpose was if we're only accepting the recommendations that we were going to do anyway, and then we're not even thinking about the kind of the more imaginative ones, because that's not how the state works. And I don't mean to kind of talk down the work of the Convention or undermine it, but I'm just wondering about the thought process that was put into before we set up all this work and put it in motion. Again, other ideas recommended in its other reports and in this report are in legislation proposed from colleagues, so they're not necessarily new ideas. And we may not have had to go through all this work to come to a point of where we already were. The other thing I think is important when looking through some of the responses to the Convention's recommendations, and indeed some of the Convention's own thinking itself, is that we can't become paralysed by analysis. If we think through, you know, the different iterations of a reform and what might be the consequences, we will find flaws. But we'll find that everywhere, and we can't let that keep us from actually making changes that just need to be made because something's not working and we know it. And, you know, if we were led by that fear all the time, nothing would change. The status quo would maintain. That kind of thinking. You know, 3, 4 and 5-seat constituencies have served us well since 1948, so we're not going to change it. You know, and they'll give you all sorts of reasons as to why a 5-seater is not in the interest of the state, etc. And, you know, but if the current system isn't working well, yes, there may not be a perfect system to replace it with, but we shouldn't be afraid, to try something else. And then just to speak on a couple of the Convention's recommendations. I was very disappointed that the Convention didn't recommend changing our electoral system in terms of the multi-seat constituencies. I think Deputy Griffin gave an excellent explanation as to why that isn't serving any of us well. I mean, talk about the multiplication of work. A person gets onto every TD in their constituency. If it's a 4-seater like mine, each of those TDs gets onto the person in the department. All this work has been multiplied, duplicated. It's unnecessary. And then there's the other things, of course, as well, in that it drives this hyper-localism that we see in Irish politics. And changing our electoral system in this way would be a great way to move away from that. But unfortunately, the Convention didn't recommend that. But again, it doesn't really matter because the government's making the decision on this anyway. If we aren't changing how we elect people in terms of multi-seat constituencies, then I do agree with the recommendation that the smallest constituency should be a 5-seater. And I think we see this in our European elections, how it works well, how people then will vote on the person's ideas and their principles, and not because they met them or because the person knocked on their door. Not that there's necessarily a bad thing about that either. It's important in our political system. I think it's one of the benefits is that there is accessibility. But if we want to move to a position where someone is voting for a politician based on their convictions, based on their position on something like marriage equality or abortion or something like that, then you've got to take away that hyper-localism. And if you're not going to do it through multi-seat constituencies, then you can do it by making your constituency bigger. So I do agree with that recommendation. I thought the recommendation on changing the number of Dáil Éireann to reflect the number of voters was an interesting one, but I could only agree with that if we were going to make voting mandatory, as in Australia. On the establishment of an electoral commission, Absolutely, but we should have done this in our first 6 months because of all the referendum we've had and all the ones we're going to have. This would have been a great thing to put in place then, and then let them conduct all the different referenda over the course of our 5 years in government. As for extending polling hours and days, I think that's a no-brainer. It happens in Europe, it should happen here. Greater access to postal voting, yes, absolutely, it happens in Europe, it happens in a lot of other countries. Also the possibility of voting when you're abroad through your embassy. Huge queues for one of the recent elections, I think it was in Romania, in my own constituency, people going to the local embassy to vote. We should be doing that. It can be done. It's not impossible. It's actually very simple. And what really bothers people is if they happen to be away at the time of an election, and particularly in 2011, it really bothered people because they really wanted to vote in that one, and they couldn't. So I think these simple changes, you know, we're saying let's let the Electoral Commission look at it. Well, you know, again, it's just a further delay. It's just kicking things down the road, and it's unnecessary. But I do agree with it, with the ideas. Improving the accuracy of the electoral register is incredibly important because we all know in here the electoral register is incredibly inaccurate. And people are on a number of registers around the country, as it happens, as they move about in their lives. So that needs to change, because also the problem with that is it's not giving us an accurate reflection of the actual turnout. And that's important because we need to know actually, in terms of the level of participation in society, how many are coming out to vote. Introducing a relevant education programme in schools. You know, we actually had a very good education programme in schools where TDs and staff from the Oireachtas would go out. Actually, Chair, you and I did it in a school in Terranure together. Excellent programme, engage with the students, tell them a bit about what we do. Unfortunately, funding meant we have to cut that back. But you know, education is very, very important in schools, and I find that when we have school tour groups in here, they get a huge amount out of it. It's really brilliant. And something I've started to do lately is to then give them a Q&A session. I know a number of my colleagues do it as well in somewhere like the AV room, and then they get even more. And that's the best way to do it. And actually, because we already have the facilities here, we have the people, and we do it, I think that's the first step you take there. Get every school in and make sure every school has been in, and to do it that way. And then the other thing was, yeah, it's not about electoral reform, but it's about composition of cabinet or ministerial positions, to permit the appointment of non-Oireachtas members as ministers, and then require Dáil members to resign their seat upon appointment to ministerial office. I don't agree with that. And you know, if we want the American system, the executive government style, then that's a complete change from parliamentary democracy. What we actually have, I think, is quite good, because the person you elect into the Dáil, who is then elected by the Dáil into cabinet, is politically and electorally responsible. So what you do is you match them with an expert. You make sure that the Secretary General of their department is the expert that you would take from industry or from wherever you would take them. Put those two people together. The person who has the expertise and experience, and the person who has the political accountability and also the political understanding. And that's the great force. And if you look at how that's worked in a very good example, I think, Michael Noonan and John Moran. And a very, very good partnership at the head of the Department of Finance, and that's what we should be working towards. And what that means actually is not changing how we appoint people to cabinet, but making changes in the civil service so that people from outside can more easily move into those senior positions and move in and out of the civil service, so that we have the best possible person in each department at the very top. I mean, it should be open to a minister as they walk into a new department to say, you know what, I got the best guy to run this department. He used to run an airline, he'd be perfect. And to bring them in and to work with them. They're politically responsible, but this person has the management expertise and the expertise in the field. And I think that's what people are trying to get at when they make these recommendations, because they feel that something's not working. But from my point of view, I think that the fault actually lies on what we can do, the flexibility at the top of the civil service. But they're the recommendations I wanted to speak on. I do think that when we speak on the next report in the Constitutional Convention, hopefully it's the one on reform of the Dáil itself, that much more time is given to it. And the government doesn't come in prejudging the recommendations and telling us which ones we have to accept. Because then what is the whole point of this exercise?